Yes. Welcome back, producer friends. Today's video, you seen the title. Serum is way too complicated of a synth to have some boring ass patches. So, I'm just going to show you a few little tips and tricks that I use. No, really nothing fancy at all. Most of them are pretty subtle, but I think they add a little bit of depth and texture and character to your sounds. But first, if you like content like this, you're a nerdy producer like me, go ahead and subscribe to my channel. I'm posting every Saturday, and I'll probably be posting a little bit here and there throughout the week, trying to experiment with different things. But I also will post some DJ sets here and also original music. So it's kind of just a channel for all of my creative stuff as far as music goes. But anyways, we'll get into it. Okay, the first example I have is a little pluck sound. The gray one is obviously the boring one, so let's go ahead and listen to that, see what it sounds like. Okay, so it's literally a detuned saw wave with a low pass filter on it, the default low pass filter. And I'm using this LFO on envelope mode without the BPM setting, so I have this rate here in hertz rather than quantified time. Quantified time. That sounds like it'd be a progressive metal band from the 80s. Anyways, yep, so that's literally all that's going on in this patch. Pretty boring. But our little saucy version, our little saucy friend here, that saucy Sally right here. Right. So what's going on here is there's a little bit more stereo width, and then there's also a little something on top, a little sauce on top. But it's actually not sauce at all. It's an oscillator. Who knew? So what I'm doing here is a little trick that I don't see a lot of people using. So I took that same saw wave we had in the first patch, and I duplicated it onto oscillator B and just changed the detune slightly, and then I panned them left and right. So what this does is creates a nice stereo image because they're both detuned slightly differently. So you have a different stereo image on the right and a different stereo image on the left. Voila, stereo width. As far as the little plucky bit on top, the actual little bell kind of sound, I'm actually using this sub for that, so I'll solo that real quick. Right. And I'm actually pushing it up an octave, and what I'm doing is I have an LFO used as an envelope routed to the level of the sub, but there's this little gap here. See this little gap right here? So it kind of creates what's called a flam. Like drummers use this a lot of the time when you kind of have a, instead of just a, you have, and it kind of just creates character. It kind of makes it a little bit more whimsical, and yeah, I really don't know if whimsical is the right word at all, but that's what I'm going with. It gives it some rhythmic character, I guess I would say. So together those sound like this. So you hear how it's a tiny bit later. I can even make it more obvious. And that would be cool to just route to a macro and mess with throughout, you know, your song or something like that even. But yeah, so just a few really simple techniques, I think kind of really took it from something just a little bit more interesting. So if you have an exposed section of your song, like a breakdown, you know, and you have like maybe two synths going, you want those synths to have as much character as possible, because if not, you're really going to lose the interest of the listener. And the whole thing with making songs is, you know, keeping the listener's attention and kind of creating drama. It's like theater for your ears. Wow. So thingamabob number 2. We got boring little chords right here, and we got some spicy boys, some spicy Sams. Let's listen to the chords on their own. Very dead mouse, so you know that tickles my jimmies. So another detuned saw wave with an LFO connected to an 18 dB per octave low pass filter. Ching. Literally just doing eighth notes. Sounds nice, but we could make it sound a little spicier. This This one is really subtle. Basically just adding more upper harmonics and a little bit of noise kind of to tickle your ear a little bit more rather than it seeming a little flat and digital. I notice a lot of analog synths do this where they'll have a little bit of noise just kind of lurking in the background. And sometimes when I first got analog synths, it freaking peeved me off, dude. It annoyed me so much. But then after using them to write some tunes and stuff and actually like going through the full process of recording them and trying to process them and mix them, blah, 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 I realized they add so much character with that little bit of noise, because you don't notice it really until it's in a really exposed section that comes with analog synths. So kind of recreating something like that here. Let's see what I did. So I kept the saw wave the same and added a triangle wave also going through the filter. Oh, excuse me, a sine wave also going through the filter, and pitched it up 2 octaves. This just adds a few little upper harmonics. It's really subtle, but I think it really adds a lot, especially in like exposed sections when you have maybe this and like one bass synth going and some little effects or background things. I think these things really make a difference. And we also have a noise set to AirCan 2 noise oscillator. Well, not oscillator. I think it's just a sample playback thing. Set to the same LFO. So the noise level is moving with the filter level. And the noise is not being routed through the filter. So it's just constant over the top the whole time. So sounds nice. Another thing that I freaking love to do is use this phaser. Pull the rate down to 0, take the depth, and I have it just doing a quarter note thing right now. It just gives a very Vocaloid kind of sound, a very formant-y kind of sound, but it's in its own way, because it's doing very similar filter movement to a formant. But that's kind of a taste thing. You can just play with where you like the depth, the frequency, but pull that rate down to 0. That keeps it from moving on its own. So then when you move the depth, that's just where it's going to go. So you can essentially, I could do the same thing if I set the rate to quarter note, but I like having more control over it. And then just a little hyperdimension, high rate, low detune, just mix at 25%. That seems pretty standard. But yeah, so we went from this. I think one just has a little bit more depth to it, you know, and I think that if you were using if you're listening to this on a phone or something like that, these details aren't necessarily going to come through. But I mean, you know, you got to write for all listening environments, right? So these details might not come through on a phone. So you might be like, who cares? But what about the people listening on nice headphones or nice hi-fi speakers, or even in a car with nice speakers? You know, you really want there to be depth there. I don't know, kind of a rant. Okay, let's move on to this little stab sound. So we got a boring one. Let's see what that sounds like. Pretty boring, yeah. And we got a little quite nice cutie right here. Right, so I actually had a friend of mine ask me, I did something similar in one of my songs, and he asked me what that little flutter noise was, and I was just like, you know, maybe I'll just throw that into this video because it worked out pretty good for that song. So let's see what I did. The boring synth is going to be just this BS2 filthy oscillator, wavetable normal, detune, unison set to 6, detune a little bit, and just a little bit of reverb. And LFO1 set to a low pass, the default low pass filter. Just doing a little bit of movement there with the filter. Not anything crazy. Let's listen to this quite nice one. Right, so again, I'm just adding another oscillator on top, pitching it up by 1 octave, and I'm not running it through the filter in this case, so it's just there constantly, and I'm not detuning it either. That's just going to add some solid upper harmonics that aren't wavering at all because they're not detuned. And I'm actually doing the same thing with the sub, but up 2 octaves. However, the difference is that I'm taking this LFO2 and I'm rounding it to the level of oscillator B and the sub. And I have the LFO set to 30-second notes, which gives the flutter effect. So if I solo just those, sounds a little odd, but then you add the other oscillator on top, And it becomes kind of a nice detail almost to it. Something simple that you can just throw in there to kind of catch a listener's ear, so it's not just a big stabby chord. It's a little something going on in there, something a little rhythmic, a little bit of rhythmic character. That seems to be a big thing with me, apparently. Yes, we have an LFO3 moving upwards like this, almost on like a upward sawtooth, set to the hyper dimensions, so it goes wide throughout its duration. And then just a little bit of chorus and a little bit of reverb. Nothing really too crazy going on with the effects here. The real thing is with the rhythmic character of the sub and oscillator B set to 30-second notes. So that's a pretty cool little trick, I think. Let's move on to this ARP. And let's try these Ooh La La Larry. So a lot being done in this one. Our boring synth is going to be this BS2 acid oscillator with a really, really short envelope, like 267 milliseconds. And I drew in the MIDI for the ARP, and those are going at 30-second note intervals. But that doesn't really matter. We're mostly focused on the patch right now. And that's literally it. It's like the most simple patch it could possibly be. But we're going to turn it into that. So what we do for that one is keep the envelope the same, keep oscillator A the same. We're going to go ahead and use the sub oscillator again, pitching it up 2 octaves. And we're going to have this LFO doing a lot of the heavy lifting. So you see I have it set to quarter notes, and it's routed to the pulse width modulation of oscillator A. That is going to give this oscillator a little bit of character and movement throughout the quarter notes. Also, I have a little bit of noise, surprise, surprise, set to it, and the level of the sub oscillator set to this LFO1. So it's basically cycling through all of these settings at a quarter note interval, which gives it a little bit of movement. For the effects, all it is a little hyperdimension, and I'm actually taking this flanger here, this flange filter here, and pulling the cutoff all the way down and using it almost like a reverb. I'll show that. So it's kind of being used as a crazy delay, but I have it kind of just in the background. Just something kind of, it adds a little texture without being just a regular old delay. That's a nice little trick I like to use, so I figured I'd throw it into this patch. Okay, and let's move on to the bass. Pretty boring. Let's listen to this Fat Freddy right here. Okay, so a couple things going on here. Let's take a look at this boring patch. It's literally just going to be surprise, surprise. Another low pass filter set to this envelope, LFO being used as an envelope, that is, and a square wave being run through it. Pretty simple. I think any of you guys could probably figure that one out by ear. And as far as the fat version goes, I went ahead with the microcorg noise. It's so nice and not brittle. I love this noise. You just got to pitch it up a little bit, but it's really nice on bass sounds. It sounds really smooth. Also, what's interesting here is that I'm using oscillator B with a saw wave pitched up an octave and then detuned. Typically, you don't want to detune your basses unless you're working with like a respace where you're specifically detuning it, because it'll cause a lot of monocompatibility issues, especially in the sub. However, with this one, the fact that I'm pitching it up an octave is going to, around the 80, 100 hertz, 120 hertz area, make it wide. But that sub note, that like 40 hertz, 50, 60 hertz, is going to stay mono. So it's a way to bring presence to your bass, stereo width to your bass, but it doesn't mess up the mono compatibility. I can show that right now, actually. Also, I'm not running the noise through the filter, so it's just constant the whole time. And what I'm doing here with this distortion is just, I'm using this filter and I have it set to 430 hertz right here. So everything above that is going to be driven pretty hard. I can go ahead and demo that. I'm basically taking that super raw, dirty signal and mixing it into the clean signal. Just gives a little bit more presence around the 500 to like 2K range, and it brightens up the noise as well, which I find really nice, especially when you're having the bass compete with a lot of different elements like drums and hi-hats and blah blah blah. And yeah, that's pretty much it. That's how I add texture to my Serum patches. If you liked this video, go ahead and comment, like, subscribe, do all the things, and I will see you guys in the next one. Peace.